Before we get into that, let's go over some of the legal contexts that are specific to ELLs and special education. So some of the legislation that has come out to protect students with regard to special education referral is the Civil Rights Act. And this states that it is a violation to exclude children from effective participation in school because they can't understand English. Some of the requirements that it stated was that school districts needed to take steps to rectify any of these deficiencies in language that they saw children having. They also wanted to notify minority parents especially of school activities and procedures. And they also stated that you cannot label an English language student as having any disabilities if any of the criteria that they used was based on or reflected their English language proficiency. Diana versus State Board of Education in 1970 set the status that English language learning students cannot be labeled as having disabilities based on an IQ test that was given in English. So this is more specific with regard to the Civil Rights Act. And also the assessment that is used to try and determine whether special education is appropriate. They said that that assessment had to be either in the first language or it had to represent a nonverbal IQ test, so that they would take away the any unfairness with regard to English, right? Taking that test in English. Okay, Larry P. versus Riles stated that IQ tests have to take into account the cultural background of children, and they should be validated on the populations that the child is a part of before that child takes that test. So because we know that cultural background and cultural perspectives really do influence the ways in which students are able to perform on a test, this Larry P. versus Riles law tried to protect that cultural component of English language learning students and other students that came from diverse backgrounds. Okay, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 1975 stated that English language learners should not be eligible for services if their learning problems resulted from any disadvantages with regard to environment, culture, or economy, right, socioeconomic status. The assessment has to be completed with people who were familiar with the child, who saw the child at different times during the week, during the day. Parents had to be invited to the meetings, had to have translators so that they understand what the procedures were and what was actually going to take place. And the team has to consider the language needs of the English language learner. Okay, so there are three specific phases towards special education referral. The first phase, and again, this takes place once the teacher has put in a request to check if an English language learner student needs special education. So once that request has been put into place, the first thing that the team, that the assembled team is going to look into is the school environment. And the question that should be asked is, are instructional strategies appropriate for ELLs? So the first place in which they're going to investigate is in the actual classroom of the ELL. The teacher should be observed. Notes should be taken on the ways in which the teacher is trying to differentiate instruction with the ELL, also the additional ways in which she or he is trying to help the student progress in English. And something specifically that is different than what she or he is doing for the rest of the students that may have different needs. Phase 2 would be early intervention. So before this child is tracked into special education, they're going to try and remediate the issue in the classroom without having put the child into that program. So the first step would be to give an assessment in the first language and in English. Okay, and the point of this is to separate what the child can do in their first language and then compare it to what the child is doing in English, so that you can see the effect of that sort of that second language and learning that second language, and see what the child can actually do in the language that they're proficient in. They're also going to check if the vocabulary is on track for grade level. Spontaneous conversation samples should be included because they want to capture the child's language abilities in different situations, right? So not only in the formal situation where the student is learning academic knowledge or showing the ability to answer academically, but also in situations where they're talking to peers, talking in lunchtime, and being able to be a part of a spontaneous conversation that might be more informal. Closed tests to assess background knowledge and grammar knowledge should also be included. We're going to go over closed tests towards the end of this class. But this would be really a sort of a gauge of how much cultural knowledge the student has learned so far, and also grammatical knowledge with regard to morphology and syntax. The framework for assessment, parents need to be involved in that referral and assessment process. So that team should be interviewing the parents and the family to gain an understanding of the child's background experiences. And those experiences are tied to language use and development, their preferences in language use, also their level of proficiency and their performance abilities in that first language. What other aspects that should be looked into is the sociological background of the child. For example, how have the parents or how has the caretaker raised the child? What is the family structure? Who is sort of available? Who is present? How much the family is sort of situated within the culture? Do they have a support system in their own culture? And how many members of the different cultures do they know? It would also be a good idea to look at the literacy practices that are taking place at home. How many books are at home? Does an adult or does a sibling read with the child? How often is a child expected to interact with literacy, and in what ways are they supported at home? Beliefs about intelligence, disability, and education are important because this really gives you an idea or a sort of a glimpse into what the parents believe, what they value, and how they would support the students or not in school. Also, the family's communication styles are going to tell you a lot about what the student expects communication to look like and how different it might be from the type of communication that takes place in the classroom. Okay, the last two things that should be discussed with the parents in the interview should be the child's developmental and medical history. Again, those aspects can influence the way that the child is able to perform. And the social and emotional functioning of the child, if there has been anything that needs attention in the past, or that the child has struggled with socially or emotionally. The English language learner should be observed in multiple contexts in order to sort of look at their behavior and monitor their behavior. Again, in school, both in times where instruction is taking place and in more informal settings, such as outside the classroom with peers. When interviews take place with the family, observations of the English language learner with their siblings and with adults should take place. And also, it's important to ask those that you interview to give you a second-hand account of their observations of that student's behavior. Okay, so the clinical teaching cycle refers to the fact that you teach first and then understand the areas that students need more support in. Then you teach with different modalities to try and ensure that students are going to understand the material better, that it's more comprehensive to them. And also to integrate assessment into your teaching that would pinpoint the areas that the student may need help. Based on those assessments that you give the students, those should be telling you how you should modify instruction. And basically, you should be modifying your instruction at all points so that your teaching is very much aligned with the specific needs of the English language learner. So in that phase 2, in that early intervention piece, that clinical teaching cycle should be forefronted to make sure that the teacher is actually engaging in differentiated instruction. Okay, and here are some other considerations of the observing team. Okay, 10 questions that the observing team will want to answer for themselves and go out and get information for. Have other adults working with the child in the school noticed similar difficulties? Does the problem exist across contexts? Are there problems evident in the first language? Is the student's progress in acquiring English significantly different from that of their peers, who started at about the same level of English proficiency, and have they had comparable instruction? It's really important for this question to make sure that the English language learners that you're going to compare the student to come in with the about the same level of English proficiency. It is also helpful if those English language learners come in with the same background language, right, that same first language. Are there cross-cultural differences? Are there other variables that can explain difficulties or contribute to them? Is there extreme test anxiety? Can problematic behaviors be caused or explained by procedural mistakes in the assessment process? Can problematic behaviors be explained by bias during the assessments? Do data show that the student did not respond well to interventions? There might be some underlying reasons for that. Are the assessment results consistent with the concerns of the teachers and or the parents? Okay, so after answering all of those questions, and there are actually 11, not 10, this should give a clear indication to the team and to the teacher whether the issue relies on language proficiency, whether the issue relies or is based upon classroom context-based reasons, or if it's school-based or family-based or society-based. If it's any one of those, then what that's telling you is that the child may have some issues with learning English, with coping in school, based on some outside influences, and not that they actually need help in cognition or help with language learning because of a disability per se. Okay, so once all of those questions have been answered, all of those avenues have been explored, phase 3, if it seems appropriate, would be special education referral. And even in that special education referral, the program that the English language learner is placed in should be aware of the different needs that an English language learner comes with. Okay, that English language learner, even though they have a disability, they are actually very different to other students who have disabilities but who speak English as a first language. Okay, so that program needs to support the native language competence of English language learners, because they're most likely going to have difficulties learning English. Okay, so the activities that are integrated in that program have to build on the first language and should be very acknowledging of and should recognize that culture that is tied to that first language. Also, the best sort of context that an English language learner could be placed in for special education is one where it's a linguistically rich context where students are really encouraged to interact verbally, also to do a lot of writing, so that it's really a linguistically rich context. The organization of the activities and the instruction should be varied so that the English language learner has multiple opportunities and different opportunities to engage in the knowledge. Also, the instructional strategies should be very diverse. Teachers should switch different techniques, also rely on different listening skills versus reading skills to ensure that all ELL students and special education students have a chance to understand the material.